is just a huge range of investments and identified new funding sources, including increasing gas taxes, title registration fees. That creates new dedicated revenue to every city and county, as well as the state. They also identified several policy issues, and so that included a higher level of accountability, and I'm sure the staff here are working on the transparency and continuous improvement requirements that are in that legislation to accompany that additional revenue. Also some jurisdictional transfer you guys may be working on. But value pricing was one of those aspects. So I wanted to make sure it's understood to be in the context of a very big move in transportation. In particular, I'll just say that value pricing is actually the name of a specific federal tolling program. It's called the Value Pricing Pilot Program, and I suppose it predated me, that that's the reason it ended up being called value pricing, but congestion pricing is a more familiar term. So the legislation directs the Oregon Transportation Commission to seek approval from the Federal Highway Administration to do tolling, and to seek that approval before the end of this year. And if it is approved, then the OTC is directed to implement it. That's fairly straightforward. The flexibility really is that they did prioritize that it should be on these two parts of I-5 and I-205 in the Portland region. But it can be done in segments. It doesn't necessarily have to apply to the entirety of those freeways. And it also specifically does not preclude other freeways or other agencies in their transportation system. It just says these are the first ones. And this was done in the context of considering all of the major transportation concerns throughout the state. The implementation timeline that Shoshana already referenced, those blue lines are the process we're in right now, where we have a policy advisory committee and we're doing education and engagement about the process. Over the course of the summer, we'll prepare a report based on what we learned through this process, submit that report to the Federal Highway Administration, and through that, depending on what the project is, we'll be working with Federal Highway Administration to determine what exactly the engineering analysis, traffic analysis, equity, revenue, tolling, system development that will have to occur, likely in the form of a NEPA. But it's not certain. It really will depend on what the OTC ends up requesting. The OTC convened a policy advisory committee. There are 25 members if you count the 2 members of the OTC who are the co-chairs. Having 2 members of the OTC as co-chairs is a significant commitment on their part, and it really helps by providing the leadership and also demonstrating the commitment of the OTC to this effort. We have representatives from the 4 counties, including Clark County. City of Portland, Brendan Finn is representing the City of Portland from Dan Saltzman's office. Also, Commissioner Baker Peterson from Multnomah County. We have business, transportation, equity, different kinds of representation, TriMet. It's a relatively large committee, but it's hard to imagine who you'd want to lose. So it's really good to have that much representation. There are so many questions that will need to be addressed before we actually turn the switch and have tolling. But to begin with, what the PAC is asked to do, the Policy Advisory Committee, is to identify the location for value pricing, the type of value pricing, and the kinds of mitigation strategies that the OTC should focus on. And those mitigation strategies are specifically to address impacts on environmental justice communities and surrounding neighborhoods. That is exactly within the charter what they were requested to focus on. I want to start with where we are now. We've had 3 out of 6 meetings, and those first 3 meetings have really been about learning, and so there's been a lot of information generated. We have a really qualified consulting team with decades of expertise and experience in congestion pricing. So we've gone through some screening technical analysis to sort of identify what are viable concepts that might work in this region. The next meeting is going to be April 11th, where we're going to start talking about that 3rd bullet. So back there, the mitigation strategies. We'll be talking about that at their April 11th meeting. And even though we're still at the early stages of doing technical analysis, it is a time to begin to identify those values. Because with that diverse set of stakeholders that are represented on the Policy Advisory Committee, bringing them together to identify those values and then pair them with the concepts that are being considered and the experience and, like exactly the kinds of things that Shoshana was just talking about. The safety on the surrounding streets should not be degraded. That we should be looking for ways to ensure affordability for low-income residents. Those are not things, this is the first time I saw that, but that is exactly the kind of input that we want to see if we can bring the committee together to the degree that there would be consensus or a strong majority. And if there's not a strong majority, that would be useful input as well. That will go to the OTC, and they want to know what are the priorities, the real values and priorities that would make this successful for this region. So in thinking about equity, we have to think about it broadly, because it's very easy to think only about the out-of-pocket cost, because nobody likes to pay out-of-pocket for something that you've not been paying for in the past. But we know that we actually don't have a system that starts from an equitable standpoint. There's much more going on. So we want to make sure that we're thinking about improving mobility for all sectors of society, for the broadest possible reach of population, business and personal, all ranges of income. So how are we providing input? How are we making sure that benefits are shared? What choices are we providing? These are the kinds of questions we want to think broadly about equity, and to have our policy advisory committee and members of the public think broadly about that as well. We know that there are existing inequities. For example, if we have a system today, one of my favorite soapboxes as a transportation planner is that the system we have today in many areas basically requires you to own a car. If we haven't successfully provided an alternative to owning a car, then we've basically obligated citizens to pay $10,000 a year, which is the approximate annual cost of owning a car. So that's an inequity already built into the system. Obviously, the housing and jobs balance for land use planning and development is a huge issue, especially as housing costs go up, lower income households move further away, they have longer trips, so there's a lot that goes into that system. Traditional funding sources. We've traditionally paid for our infrastructure with fuel taxes. But oftentimes lower income folks are driving less fuel efficient vehicles, paying disproportionately higher into that fund. And is that what we're going to continue to rely on to build our infrastructure? I'm not suggesting that congestion pricing is going to address all of that, but that there is a broad perspective of equity that we want to be able to think about, so we don't simply try to look mathematically at the very real issue of an added out-of-pocket cost for commute trips. And that is something we need to take seriously, as long as we can think about sharing the benefits first and mitigating the negative impacts of that added cost. There are other programs we can learn from. I'm going to go through them more. I'm going to skip them. I'm just going to say incentives for high occupancy vehicles, for example. Special programs to make sure that folks who don't have bank accounts also have access. In fact, I think there's state policy that requires that we do that, which is fine, because that's something we would want to do. And enhancing multimodal investments. And while Shoshana is accurate, that is correct, that there is a constitutional restriction on the use of these funds, and it wouldn't be eligible to pay for transit operations. We don't necessarily think that we have to limit the discussion to these tolling revenues. If it's most important to make sure that transit is improved, if that's what the Policy Advisory Committee wants to recommend to the OTC, they should recommend it to the OTC. They're not capped in what they think is most important. The OTC will take it under consideration and consider other forms of revenue if they choose. We've had a lot of public outreach. We did our winter round, and I just want to say that I have worked on a lot of projects in the past 20 years, and I've never had quite as much engagement. So we did 3 open houses live. We also had an online open house. We had 1,800 completed questionnaires over the course of about 2 weeks. Not just people who started it, but actually completed it. And that number of 750 emails and voicemails is an old number. But we do our best to read them all, and if they ask a question, we respond. We've had several people say, I've never had anybody call me back before. We had, so the blue dots show where we had open houses in the winter, and we're having 4 of them. We have 3 of them: Vancouver, Lloyd Center, and Clackamas Town Center. And then we're going to have 4 more in the next couple of weeks. I'll share those dates later if you want. Some of the common themes, we did want to get grounded in the nature of the problem, and that is congestion. And we asked people, how does it affect you? And it affects their time they spend in traffic, of course, increased stress and anxiety, unpredictable travel time, and adjusting the route to avoid congestion. I think that's important because we are concerned about diversion that would come as a result of tolling, but we have diversion right now that comes as a result of congestion, in case anybody here has ever avoided a freeway and taken a local street. But there are, of course, concerns about congestion pricing, and we do hear these themes from all cross-sections. Impacts on low-income communities, diversions onto the surface streets and into neighborhoods, and questions and ideas about how revenue should be raised. So we are hearing these across the board, and I think that these are areas where we want input. So I'm really mindful of the time. It's kind of hard to skip too much because if I leave it void, it will be filled with imaginations. I'm going to try to be quick. We know that we have a lot to learn. Nobody in this region, hardly, has done a congestion pricing project because we don't have any congestion pricing. And so even with just those two freeways, knowing we're starting with that, as soon as you start with segments, you almost have an infinite number of possible concepts to look at. So we decided to start with representative concepts where we take the basic tools, kind of look, what if we did them all? What if we did the whole thing? Like just take it really broad, all or nothing, we called it bookends. And understand more about the range of effects of these different approaches to doing pricing. Let's start big. It's a screening level. Because we just knew that there would be many areas where there'd be geographic or topographic or environmental or development reasons that, some would and would not work. So we did that first evaluation, and I'll share a little bit about it, but not real quickly. Based on that, we came away with 5 concepts that warrant further evaluation. A lot of projects throughout the country would start there and say, well, we want to look at these projects. So this was really about learning. It was a chance for the Policy Advisory Committee, the public, the project team and staff, and then the consultant team to all learn about this region, our operations, our growth, and what could be effective. So with that round 2 of analysis that we are now beginning and will report in May, we're taking a little bit more of a refined look at performance of the concepts. So the first thing, baseline, is 2027. We wanted to start with presuming some growth of population and jobs, but assuming no pricing. So this was taken out of the regional transportation plan. It includes 700 of the projects that are included there. That's already publicly vetted and approved. There are 2 basic tools. One is to price the entire roadway, and the other is to price a lane with the adjacent lanes being unpriced. We looked at those in 2 different ways. One of them was pricing the roadway, pricing by converting an existing lane, and then the option 3 was to add a 4th lane and price that. So those were the 3 building blocks. Then I called these the bookends. So we took those building blocks and we said, let's look at if we did, that baseline is in black there. Then the blue one is, what if we priced the entire roadway for both freeways? And the green is, what if we converted a lane on both freeways? And then the orange one is, what if we added a lane, and that's a 4th lane, and priced that for both freeways. Then we looked at some combinations. So that was the approach we took. I would almost call these hypothetical concepts because for most of them, there's some reason why it really isn't feasible. But it gave us a chance to really establish that so that we could all start off with the same set of information. Then we can all bring our own opinions. But let's at least start with the same basis in fact. Some of the key findings from round 1. The priced roadway does have the highest level of congestion relief. This might not be surprising. I didn't really know that would be the case. It also operates really well for freight because as it turns out, freight can't operate in the left lane by statute in the state of Oregon, which is common in most states. Apparently there are safety and operational reasons for that. It could be reconsidered, but it is a very common restriction. There is an equity trade-off, which is that the bad side for equity is that all of the lanes are priced. But on the good side, it means that you would actually be able to maintain a lower price, and so everybody would benefit. You would also have more opportunity to have some hours without pricing it. So just because of that greater effectiveness. That's what I mean when I say we need to think about equity broadly and share the benefits, not just reduce the out-of-pocket cost impact. Pricing a lane, it turns out that in order to have a priced lane work, you have to maintain 2 unpriced lanes to be functionally, operationally feasible. That means any place where there's only 2 lanes just isn't viable. The Rose Quarter has only 2 lanes, 2 through lanes. And even with the planned project, it will still just be 2 through lanes. The section of 205 with the planned 3rd lane also has just 2 through lanes, but that has a planned widening project, which would work. So that's the only area. Knowing that, well, moving on, the freight issue, the equity trade-off here is it does maintain that free lane, but it wouldn't really share in the benefits. And then finally, constructing a 4th lane did show a lot of performance improvements in the traffic operations, but that's largely because it's a capacity expansion. And we don't go into that in this project because this is a congestion pricing project, but there's a lot of experience that shows us that the benefits from adding capacity are short-lived. So there may be a time for that in the future, but at this stage, That's really where most of that benefit comes from. They generate very limited revenue. And it would also be limited by the downstream bottlenecks at the bridges and also to the northern segment of 205. So there are some limitations in how far it would go. So I'll show you now what the concepts are that the consultants are in the project team. We have a project team that includes Metro and Southwest Washington Regional Transportation Council staff and ODOT plus consultants. So they are analyzing now 5 different segments. One of them is this concept A, the northern segment of I-5. There's a short, high occupancy vehicle lane. So this concept would convert that to a toll lane, meaning that you could also use that if you pay a price, pay the toll, and then having a parallel one in the southbound direction. So as we're doing the analysis, some of the things we need to look at, well, how is it operating right now? Because you don't want to convert it to a toll lane if you're actually crowding out folks who are currently carpooling and trying to get the benefit of that